Hello, and thank you for being with us. My name is Nelson France, and I serve as Director of Partnerships and Development for the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, CAM. We're joined today for the second in our CAM author series, today with Mr. Ben M. Freeman, founder of the modern Jewish Pride movement, a Jewish leader, Jewish thinker, and a Jewish educator. Ben M. Freeman is the author of Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People and Reclaiming Our Story, the Pursuit of Jewish Pride. He is an internationally renowned gay Jewish author and educator focusing on Jewish identity and historical and contemporary Jew hatred. A Holocaust scholar for over 15 years, Ben has come to great prominence during the late Corbyn labor Jew hate crisis, and quickly became one of his generation's youngest Jewish leading thinkers and voices against anti-Jewish racism, not just in the UK, but again, internationally. In his first book, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, he speaks about the importance of Jews defining their own identities as proud Jews through Jewish experience, Jewish history, and Jewish values. And his second book is due out this Monday. I'm so pleased to be joined by you, Ben M. Freeman. Ben, thank you for being with us. To get the conversation started, what life experiences, family history, and personal values define you, knowing that not everyone in our audience is familiar with you and your work?
So I am from, well, first of all, let me say thank you so much to Cam for having me, and to you, Nelson. I was born in Glasgow, Scotland, so a very small Jewish community. I always say that there was a diaspora within, or there is a diaspora within a diaspora. So Glasgow is very much not a center of Jewish life in Britain, and that impacted kind of my Jewish identity growing up. I'm also a gay man, and my journey to LGBTQ plus pride is really something that has informed so many different aspects of my life, including my journey to Jewish pride. Now, as a teen, I'm 35 years old. So I was born at the tail end, or really actually the midst of the AIDS epidemic. And when I understood my sexual orientation, I was filled with deep self-loathing. I'd internalized homophobia, and it was really an awful experience. But in that, I realized something quite profound. There was a moment where I realized I had done nothing wrong. I was being punished for a crime I hadn't committed. And that realization eventually led me on a path to LGBTQ plus pride. And that journey, the lessons I learned on that journey, are what inspired my kind of life's work, which at the moment is certainly dedicated to spreading Jewish pride. And it's something I've always felt. It's something that's always been a part of my life. I remember, being a child in Scotland, and at Rosh Hashanah, we've just celebrated Rosh Hashanah, so Shabbat Tov, everyone. I remember us eating pomegranate. Rimonim. I remember very specifically eating pomegranate, and I understood that pomegranate wasn't indigenous to Scotland. I understood that we ate pomegranate because that came from our indigenous land, the land of Israel. So I've always had this connection to the land of Israel, to our Jewishness, to my Jewish identity. But certainly the lessons I learned from my experience as a gay man have informed even more how I feel about my Jewishness, and certainly, as I said, my work.
And going off of that, throughout these two books, and I was fortunate to get a sneak peek of your upcoming work, and certainly have read the first one. Jewish pride, this is something that you kind of championed. Why is it urgent and essential? Not just for the Jewish people, but for humanity, for all kinds. Why Jewish pride and why now?
The reason it's urgent is because we are experiencing a crisis, and the crisis is the rise in Jew hate. So 2021 was deemed through statistics to be the worst year in a decade for Jew hate. And I think that most Jewish people who are listening would say, even anecdotally, that things are getting worse all the time. And what we need to do is understand how that hate affects us. And that's something that we as a community are not very good at doing. We're not very good at understanding how we, not only just our experiences actually, but then how they impact us. So, Jew hatred is getting worse. It's getting worse year after year after year. How does that make us feel? Or how does that affect us? What does that make us feel? And my work, especially in Britain with Corbyn, was that we need to inoculate ourselves against the virus of Jew hatred. And we also need to understand whose problem Jew hatred is. Now, what I'm about to say may seem quite radical to some people, but actually, I'm going to say that Jew hate is not a Jewish problem. Jew hate impacts Jews, but it is very much a non-Jewish problem. Meaning, if the non-Jewish world ever hopes to solve it, they need to actually set about that task. We take part in the fight. We share our experiences. We dialogue. Of course we do. There's movements and organizations like yours, work like my own. Of course we take part in the fight, but Jewish people are not able to combat Jew hatred alone. But what can we do? We can, as I said, build that inoculation, build that barrier to stop us internalizing it. Because when you hear over and over and over again negative messages, we internalize them. It makes us see our Jewishness as a source of shame and not pride. It makes us want to diminish our Jewishness. And those are things that I cannot tolerate. I cannot tolerate the non-Jewish world making us feel like that. And the reason I feel so passionate is because, as we've just discussed, I have my own experiences with internalized homophobia, with shame regarding my gay identity. And I know what that did to me. And I know what shame does to Jewish people. And I know what internalized anti-Jewishness does to Jewish people. And that is why now, because we are in a crisis and it is getting worse and worse. And we have to understand how we are responding. How are we preparing our young people? When they're going to go to college, are they feeling, okay, I may experience some Jew hate, but I don't care because I'm a proud Jew? Or are they going to say, you know what, to keep quiet, to have an easier life, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to keep my head down. I'm not going to prioritize my Jewishness. The reality is there's a choice right now. We're at a crossroads. And because of the crisis, we have a path to choose. Is it the status quo or is it pride? And you know what my choice is.
Can you give us a couple of examples just recently in the last week, 2 weeks? There's been a lot of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, from individuals around the world, some prominent, some not, about why those statements or incidents, whether they be vandalism, whether they be physical, whether they be threats, why they're hurtful, and more importantly, how you've responded to it and how you encourage people to take action. Because I think that at times this issue of anti-Semitism, as well as philo-Semitism, celebrating Jewish pride, I think for some it can become exhausting. But knowing that there's an opportunity to take action, that can be helpful.
You're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of examples, unfortunately, there are so many. I mean, maybe the obvious one that springs to mind is Kanye West. Kanye West in the last week has kind of gone on a tirade against Jewish people. He talks about Jewish Zionists having power. He's talks about going DEFCON 3 on the Jewish people. And statements like that are hurtful because they wound us. They wound our integrity. We're human beings. We're meant to be whole, and they slowly chip away. And maybe not even that slowly. They sometimes take big chunks of our integrity away. And also the thing is, there's something else happening. And we're experiencing all of this hate. We're experiencing Kanye. We're experiencing, what Donald Trump said about Jews being grateful to him, which whether or not Jews are grateful to him, that is not an appropriate thing for a non-Jewish person to say, that the Jews should be grateful, as if we should be on our knees in a submissive position. It's all of these things are happening, and then they're also ignored by the wider world. So It's not that Jews are the only ones experiencing prejudice. We know that's not the case. But what we're seeing with other communities, particularly with regards to in the progressive world, we're seeing allyship. We're seeing people coming out and standing up. That has not happened for Jewish people. If we look at the celebrities that have commented, we saw Jamie Lee Curtis, David Schwimmer, and I'm talking comments about Kanye, Jamie Lee Curtis, David Schwimmer, and Andy Cohen. What's the thing that unifies all of them? They're Jews. When something happens to Jews, it's only Jews who respond. And that is really a form of gaslighting on a global scale, because we're made to feel as if we don't matter. Because really, truth be told, in some spaces in the non-Jewish world, we don't matter. You know, David Baddiel wrote a book called Jews Don't Count, and that's really the case. And it hurts us because we're being wounded or we're being attacked, and yet no one is saying anything. And it is exhausting. And I have people online who speak to me on Instagram and on other kind of social media platforms who write to me and say, I'm exhausted. I feel so upset. What do I do? The thing that I say is the most important thing is Jewish pride. We're going to love ourselves regardless. We're going to speak up. And I've spoken up on Twitter several times. I know many, many people have. We're going to speak up. We're going to show that we deserve better and that we know we deserve better. But also we're going to celebrate our Jewishness. And I said to the person who was messaging me, is there anything Jewish you can do? And she was like, yeah, I think I'm going to go to Shul this Shabbat. And she said it's got a lot of ruach, a lot of spirit, a lot of songs. It'll make her feel positive about her Jewishness, because this is what happens when we're traumatized. Our relationship with the thing that becomes the source of the trauma, i.e. our Jewishness, that becomes warped. So our Jewishness becomes the source of the trauma. Our Jewishness becomes the source of the pain. And that is not the case. It is the hate from the non-Jewish world. But we, again, as I said, we have to inoculate ourselves. So that is something I think we should do. You know, we have to love being Jewish, irrespective of how the world feels about us. And we're going to raise our voices. We're going to dialogue. Of course we are. But my self-esteem does not depend on Kanye West's perspectives on Jewish people.
Thank you for bringing that contemporary example to it, right? All of us see these contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism pretty much on a daily basis. But it's not every day that the person who's spewing that hatred, you know, as an audience of, what was it, 40 million, 50 million between their social media platforms, which is larger than many, you know, leaders, decision makers of
Absolutely
countries. So it's important to speak out against it. And personally, I thought the Jamie Lee Curtis response was really good. I just wish there had been more from other stakeholders.
Absolutely.
Especially in the industry.
You're absolutely right. And we have to remember that there is about 15.23 million Jews in the world. We're still not at our pre-Holocaust levels yet. Kanye West has 30 million followers on Twitter. That is what we're up against here. There is also, as it always has been for us, it's a bit of a numbers game, particularly online. There are just not that many of us. So when you see people with millions and millions and millions, far more many millions of followers than there are Jews in the world, that's quite scary, because we see this message being circulated, being normalized, and we can fight back. But there's a limit of what we're able to do just because of the numbers. And yes, I mentioned 3 celebrities. They're the only 3 celebrities I've seen raise their voices: Jamie Lee Curtis, David Schwimmer, and Andy Cohen. There are many Jewish celebrities. There's many Jewish high-profile people. Everyone should be coming out, every non-Jewish celebrity, because we deserve allyship, just as every other community does. Yeah. What Kanye said is reprehensible. And everyone, and listen, I have to say, I did see many people from the Black community criticize him. I think that's important to reference. But everyone should be criticizing him, Jewish and non-Jewish, and we should be uniting and standing together and say, this is unacceptable. You know what happened, Kanye, the last time people went DEFCON 3 and the Jewish people? 6 million Jews were murdered. Take responsibility of the things that you've said and understand why you've said them. It's not just about going to a museum or going to Auschwitz and learning. He has some deep unlearning to do so he can go and learn about what it means to be a Jew in this world.
Right. I think, and you know, we have a few other questions, things, different themes to get to. But the one thing I'll say is what's frightening about the Kanye piece is that there's others who believe these exact same conspiracy theories. He's not the first influential musician to align themselves with Louis Farrakhan
No.
beliefs and very, very dangerous individuals when it comes to Black nationalism, when it comes to defining who is and who is not a Jew.
Yeah.
So all people of good moral conscience should be concerned about Kanye and anyone else who has a platform, whether it be to 100 people or 100 million people.
Absolutely. And to take the conversation wider, you're absolutely right. The things that Kanye is saying are things that have been said about Jewish people for millennia.
Right.
It was said by the Nazis, it was said by the Soviets, it was said in the 19th century, it was said in the Spanish Inquisition, it was said when Jews were being expelled from England, it was said in the Muslim world when Jews were dhimmi, when the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews were second-class citizens. These are the things that have been said about us for a millennium. And there is a direct line linking what was said 2,000 years ago all the way through, and Kanye is part of that. So this is why it matters. It's exactly as you said, it's not isolated. It's not just Kanye West having mental health problems. That is ableist. Just because you have mental health problems doesn't mean that you go on a racist tirade. Kanye West is a conspiracist, and he has absorbed conspiracies that have been kind of referenced for millennia. So the story is much bigger than Kanye, actually. It's a real societal problem that we're facing. And it's why, I just referenced 2021 was said to be the worst year in a decade. I don't think 10 years ago, firstly, there was no social media, so that's obviously something to consider. But I don't think, I mean, there was social media 10 years ago. I'm just aging myself now. But I don't think 10 years ago, these kind of statements would be made so publicly. Something is changing. Something has changed.
Yep. People certainly feel emboldened to share their opinions.
Yes.
Sometimes without fear of repercussion. So based on the previous question and really the conversation so far, there's this concept of self-hating Jews. It's one that in the United States people use. Larry David on Curb Your Enthusiasm has referred to this and many others throughout society. It's seemingly gotten worse in the 21st century, this concept of it. Although you reject this terminology and you reference this term, where did self-hating Jews originate, and why do you reject this terminology?
So I will say you're right. I think the issue is the phenomenon is becoming more of a pressing issue. We can talk about that a little bit later. I'll start with why I reject it before I explain. It came from a very specific time. It came from the end of the 19th, very end of the 19th, really beginning of the 20th century, the first 20, 30 years of the 20th century. And I reject it because most Jews who experience this phenomenon don't hate themselves. They are experiencing a manifestation of internalized prejudice. And this internalized prejudice is something that Jews and gay people and Black people and women and lots of different minority groups experience. It's a human experience to internalize the hate that swirls around you. The reason I think that self-hate is not appropriate is because it's really putting the onus on the person who's experiencing it. You're a self-hater. Whereas actually that person has absorbed hate from the wider world. So we have to be really accurate and careful and nuanced and describe it for what it is, right? Self-hate is a very blanket term. Actually, as I said, the vast majority of Jews who experience this don't hate themselves, and they get it from the world beyond us. They get it from the wider world, the non-Jewish world. So I think it's very important to call it what it is, i.e. internalized Jew hate. So you could call it internalized anti-Semitism, internalized anti-Jewishness, internalized Jew hate, whatever you want. But I think the key is the word internalized. We should really move away from self-hate because it is a much wider phenomenon and it's a much more nuanced phenomenon than that word implies or that phrase implies. Now, where it emerged. It really emerged in Germany because this is where a lot of these conversations were happening at the turn of the 20th century. And kind of before that, people would speak about Jewish anti-Semites. So jüdischer Antisemitismus. That was what they were saying, like Jewish anti-Semites. And that was kind of not deemed to be accurate enough. And they're right, it's not. It's kind of, in my perspective, similar to Jewish self-hate. Okay, there's a Jewish anti-Semite, a Jewish person who's anti-Jewish, but where does it come from? Anyway, there was a man called Anton Kuh, who was a journalist, who was a writer. He was based in Austria, and he did a series of speeches. He did one in Prague, I believe, and one in a couple of other places. I'm going to say Berlin, but don't quote me on that. And he spoke about this issue. And it's really fascinating because Anton Kuh was the child of assimilation. So he was a child of assimilation, but he was rejecting it. He was saying, no, assimilation is not our friend. And he had a complicated relationship with his Jewishness, but he was rejecting assimilation because he understood what it was doing to us, and it was causing this phenomenon. You know, this desperate need to be accepted was not good for the Jewish people. Now, there was a man called Theodore Lessing who about, 10 years or so after Anton Kuh first coined the phrase, used it in a book called Jewish Self-Hate, Jüdischer Selfhass, and his name is Theodore Lessing. And he kind of wrote the seminal book on this, and he uses that phrase. And it really is of the time, and when I say I reject it, I don't reject it for them. It's more I reject it for me. I understand it from their perspective. This is the term they were working with, and they thought it was an improvement. And actually, Theodore Lessing's book is kind of remarkable. It's on my shelf back there. It's kind of remarkable because it could have been written today. And this subject is so important also because there are so few books about this. There's definitely academic articles, and there have been journalistic articles, but actually there's so few books about this. As I'm aware, there's one by David Mamet, there's one by Sandra Gilman, there's one by me now, and there's one by Theodore Lessing. So very few books about this very important subject.
The one by David Mamet's incredible for what it's worth.
Yeah.
As we're plugging other authors and other works. So clearly you reject this term, self-hating Jew, and we've had discussions previously on simply the term anti-Semitism. There are a few themes from your most recent work, which again is available on Monday, where all good books are sold, including online. One of those themes is empathy, another being reclaiming Jewish stories, and as I internalized it, ultimately moving individuals from prejudice to pride, which is kind of a unique concept. So when did you first experience Jewish pride, your first Jewish pride experience, and when did you last experience internalized prejudice?
That's a great question. Gosh, in terms of when I first experienced Jewish pride, I think I was very young. I remember understanding the difference I had as a Jew to my non-Jewish friends. And that difference is something I've always been very comfortable with. I think a lot of Jews are quite uncomfortable with the fact that we're different, that we belong to a separate civilization, a separate culture, we have our own history. But that's not been something that has ever bothered me. I've always really taken pride in that. And I think understanding that I belong to something rich and special and exciting and beautiful and joyful was something that I've always understood. And I think it was probably at high school, when I was 11, when I first started high school, because in Britain, we start high school, we don't have middle school, we start high school straight after elementary school. And I think it was then, I think that I understood there was probably a non-Jewish assembly going on at my school, and that was in a church, and the Jewish students were excused and we were allowed to go and have our own assembly. And that was really wonderful to me, not because I thought we were better, but I just understood that we were different. And I really felt joy in that and felt pride. And that's something I really encourage all Jews to understand and feel pride in. We are different, and it's okay. We're no more or no less different than any other kind of diasporic community. So for example, in Britain, British Pakistanis, British Chinese, and British Jews, we're all experiencing what it means to be British whilst also belonging to a separate civilization, and that is absolutely fine. In terms of when I last experienced internalized anti-Jewishness, I'm happy to say it's been a while, but it's certainly something I have to work on. It's something I have to work on a lot, and that's what this work entail. These overcoming these phenomenons entail is real work and constant work, constant reinforcement. And there was a friend, okay, so I have a very good friend who's friend.
And sorry to interject, can you just explain a little bit what internalized Jewish prejudice, if you were to just define that term?
So for me, internalized anti-Jewishness is when Jews absorb non-Jewish perceptions of Jewishness from the non-Jewish world and allow the non-Jewish world to define our narrative. So that's very much not self-hate, right? It's just about self-perception and where we're understanding our self-perception from. So,
an example of that being?
So an example of that being, so in the book, I can identify three main manifestations: diminishment, denial, and deployment. I'll start back and then work my way to diminishment, and that's what I'll talk about. Deployment is when we see Jews deploying their Jewishness as a weapon. So often in Britain, we call them as a Jews. So people who would say, as a Jew, I don't think Corbyn is an anti-Semite. As a Jew, I don't think Corbyn's a racist. Often they're left-wing, but not always, anti-Zionist Jews. Particularly, that's probably a big manifestation today, is the anti-Zionist Jews who use their Jewishness as a weapon against the other Jews. The denial is simple, right? They deny their Jewishness. So historically, that was converting to another religion. Today, it might just be, I'm no longer a Jew, or I have no relationship with that. That's another example. And then the first example I mentioned was diminishment. So that could be when I used to say, I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but. And what I did was I tried to make my Jewishness smaller. I wanted to make my Jewishness smaller so that I would be palatable to the people around me, the non-Jews around me. I wanted them to respect my Jewishness, but understand that it wasn't such a big deal. And actually I was just like them and it's no big deal. It's fine. Don't worry. So that's what I did.
Right.
I wouldn't want to rock the boat. I would want to keep my head down. So those are manifestations of anti-Jewishness. Now, excuse me, I probably last experienced it with one of my very close friends. And this was my problem, not his. But he is French. We met in Hong Kong. He now lives back in Paris. And he is a philosopher. So we would have philosophical conversations and we would talk about history and all of these things. And and the reality is France has a lot to answer for with Jew hatred and with perceptions of Jews. So for example, the idea that Jews are just a religion really emerged from France. 1791, in the French Parliament after the Revolution, they said, if a Jew is to be French, we cannot have a nation within a nation. If the Jew wants to be a nation, we have to expel them. So we shed our nationhood. So we were coerced into shedding our nationhood, which is one of the reasons that people today say, oh, the Jews are just a religious group. That's not true. We've never been just a religious group. It was forced onto us, that idea. Now, my friend and I would talk about this, and I didn't really feel able to get into it with him because I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't want him to think, oh, that pesky Jew insulting France and being too sensitive. That was my problem. He is a wonderful, supportive friend, but that was my internalized anti-Jewishness speaking. Whereas actually, in kind of subsequent conversations, this was a few years ago, but in subsequent conversations, I've said to him, actually, listen, if we're going to talk about Jew hatred, and we talk about it a lot, obviously, because he's my friend, and I talk about it a lot, I said we have to talk about France. We have to talk about Dreyfus, and we have to talk about the pressures put on French Jews, and we have to talk about Vichy and Zemmour and Ilan Halimi and Sarah Halimi and all of these people. We have to talk about those. And I love you, I love my friend, and I love France. I love visiting Paris, but that does not exonerate. That means I'm not going to be a good Jew just to make people feel comfortable. Maybe there's things that we should feel uncomfortable about. The murder of Jews, the continued murder of Jews is uncomfortable and we should acknowledge it. And that was a lesson I had to learn.
Thank you for sharing that. The Sarah Halimi incident in particular, I know Cam, we were very active with helping to just amplify that story globally, which is just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Could you briefly just maybe in 15 seconds share what happened with Sarah Halimi and why it's so horrific and why
Absolutely.
people should know about that story?
So Sarah Halimi was a Jewish French woman. She lived in Paris, I believe, and she was a former primary teacher, and she was attacked in a racially motivated anti-Jewish attack by someone, a man, and she was thrown off her balcony and she was stabbed. And afterwards, there was doubts about the man's mental health because he'd been smoking marijuana, and they said, well, actually, he has mental health issues, so we're going to kind of section him. We're going to have him in a hospital to treat mental health issues, as opposed to punishing him for his crime. And as you said, Nelson, Cam was involved in getting that into the world. We shouldn't need Cam to get it into the world. It's amazing that Cam exists to that, but this should be international news. A Jewish woman was murdered in France because she was Jewish. That should be global news. And similarly to Ilan Halimi, similar to other stories in France, the French authorities initially denied that it was racially motivated. They denied that it was about her Jewishness. They said, oh, it was just a random thing and he was smoking marijuana. No, this was a racially motivated attack. In the UK, we would define it as a racially motivated attack.
Right. Well, thank you for just sharing on that. I think that these stories need to live on, and none of these individuals who suffered at the hands of pure, unadulterated Jew hatred should be forgotten. In addition to being an acclaimed author, you work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, a DEI, as it's commonly referred to, specifically focusing on the Jewish experience. What is DEI? This is a term that, like many, are misunderstood, but what is DEI? What role do Jews have in it? Specifically, how can Jews be empowered by DEI? It seems like this is not a concept that is going away anytime soon.
No, you're absolutely right. I what I will say is I understand why Jews are nervous about DEI. I understand it, and I'm not here to minimize that. I share their worry. But the reason that I engage in DEI from a Jewish perspective, from a Jewish pride perspective, is because at its core, it's a good thing. At its very core, we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are absolutely many problems with how it is expressed, with how it's carried out, with how these programs are run, and they often exclude Jewish people, which is terrible, which is why I choose to do DE&I, but share Jewish experiences, share Jewish stories, reclaim our story. And I do think it's important. I think that it's a way to get people to understand what it's like to be a Jew. Really, in professional settings, people who usually do DE&I are corporations or schools or universities. Those people in duties of care or working with groups of others should understand that maybe not everyone shares your experience. And it can be okay, maybe let's not arrange a meeting for Yom Kippur. Let's not be insensitive when we're talking about the Holocaust and when we have Jewish students in the classroom. So at its core, it's a good thing. However, like many other things, it's been manipulated, and it has a very binary view, and Jews are excluded. Jews are classed often as just a religious group. Jews are classed as white. And really the idea then is that, okay, so we don't count. Back to what David Baddiel said, Jews don't count. And that really is the view in the majority of DE&I spaces. I'm here to change that. So I want to run DE&I sessions for companies, for universities, for schools, but I'm doing it from a Jewish pride perspective. And I've run D&I sessions for Facebook. And it was about Jewish history and Jewish experience and reclaiming it and not allowing, most importantly, the other to define us. We have a right to define our own experience in any setting. And there is this platform, D&I, which should be open to that. And it should be amenable to us and helpful to us. And it's not often, but I'm still going to use the basic idea that we count, Jewish people count, and companies and schools and universities, they should understand that. I'm on Monday, the day the book comes out, I'm flying to America to do a month's tour. I'm doing a speaking tour to promote the book. And amongst the speaking engagements, I'm doing various DE&I sessions for educators, because they need to know how to support Jewish students. How are they supporting Jewish students with the Kanye thing? Kanye is very famous. He is pop culture. How are the teachers? How are the administrators? How are they supporting their Jewish students? They sometimes, even though we'd like them to, they sometimes don't have all the answers. So that's where someone like me comes in and says, listen, this is how you center the Jewish experience. This is how you support Jewish people. This is how we create space for Jewish people to feel safe and feel heard.
Thank you. Now, in the book, you refer to the Jewish people as a people of denial. We were talking about this earlier. This can be jarring for people to hear, Jewish, non-Jewish alike, but it's rooted in reality and clearly facts on the ground. How are global Jewry suffering in 2022, and where did the shared trauma originate? Now, this is all with the preconceived notion that, to some degree, we are living in a golden time for the Jewish people, that we have a Jewish state, that we have a unified Jerusalem, and are able to go to the to our holy sites and what have you, and a strong state, a strong Jewish state. But at the same time, the global Jewry, is clearly suffering. Why is that?
I really just want to say I love what you said, because actually that is pride. It's not always seeing things through a lens of tears, seeing things through a veil of tears. Actually, I think to be a Jew right now is very exciting because of Jewish pride. And as you say, because we have a state, like how lucky are we? However, there's also a reality on the ground. And the reality is on the ground is that in the diaspora, Jew hate isn't even rising, it's risen. And that's not to say it can't get worse, but it has risen. As I said, 2021 was the worst year in a decade. Now, how are Jews suffering? Jews are scared, I believe. I'm speaking as a Jew myself. So let me talk about myself. I'm scared. I'm frustrated. I am aghast that this is happening and no one seems to care. I feel endlessly gaslit by the world around me. I feel scared. You know, I wear a kippah. I'm a visibly Jewish Jew, and I wear a Magen David. And usually when it's not cold and I'm not wearing a polo neck, I see yours, I have like my shirt fairly low cut, as anyone who ever comes to my other talks will see. And
a lot of V-necks, a lot of V-necks,
a lot of plunging V-necks. But I'm aware that while I make the choice to show my Jewishness because I want to move through the world as a Jew, that I'm making myself vulnerable. Whenever I walk past people, I'm aware that there's a split second that I'm walking by them, I'm a visible Jew, and who knows what their intentions are. And that's just the way I move about my streets. I move about my neighborhood in London. So Jews are scared, I think. Jews are traumatized. And we are a people of denial. And I'm saying enough is enough. The Jewish community is decades behind other communities in dealing with these issues. The Black community, the LGBTQ plus community, these other communities are having conversations about how does that hate impact us? How does that make us feel? We never do that. All we do is talk about the hate that targets us. We talk about the non-Jewish perspective all the time. What about the Jewish perspective? What about how it makes us feel? What about the sinking feeling in our guts that so many of us felt when Kanye said what he said? Or when Trump said what he said, or when Ilhan Omar, or when Jeremy Corbyn? It's a real visceral, emotional feeling. And it impacts our mental health. And I urge Jewish people to come on this journey of healing with me. And I'm not saying this as someone from a pedestal that's saying, you know, I'm fine, this is your problem. No, as I've said very clearly, this was my problem. I experienced it as a gay man and I experienced it as a Jew, and I've done the work and I understand how you move on from this, how you move forward. And in my book, I feature interviews with 5 Jews who experienced internalized anti-Jewishness and who have gone on the journeys to overcome it, because it is possible to overcome it. But we have to wake up. It's like having the disease of addiction. How could you possibly begin to solve it if you don't recognize it, right? They say the first step to the solution is recognize you have a problem. Recognize we have a problem as a collective. There is internalized anti-Jewishness in our community. I believe it's a pandemic. And this is not our fault. We are a Jewish minority living in a non-Jewish majority everywhere in the diaspora. We internalize what they think about us unwittingly. Of course we want to be accepted. Who doesn't want to be accepted? Especially given our history. And that's the thing we have to understand. It's like what we said about Kanye. It's not happening in isolation, not just because there's other people who believe it right now, but what has been done to us for thousands of years. Every Jewish person who's born a Jew, and obviously there's some Jews who join us, who convert, but every Jewish person who is born a Jew is the direct descendant of people who have survived multiple genocides, multiple ethnic cleansings, enslavements, legal persecution, segregation. That does a number on you. Trauma is inherited, and we have to start talking about it. We don't shy away from our experiences. We're not going to pretend that everything is rosy. We'll talk about the Inquisition. We'll talk about the Farhud. We'll talk about the Shoah. We'll talk about all of these things, but we'll do it in a way which is empathetic, which breeds pride, which does not breed victimhood, and which does not force Jews to see their Jewishness as something which is going to bring them pain. Because that is a lesson that many Jews are taught. Jewishness brings you pain. Jewishness makes you isolated. Jewishness makes you sad. No, Jewishness is a wonderful thing, but there is a problem and we have to address it. And it's crazy to me that we haven't. And even now, I've spoken about, whenever I speak about internalized anti-Jewishness online, there's always some smart aleck who says, this doesn't exist. It's like, so basically what you're saying is the Jewish people are not human beings. Because this is a human experience. Even in 1930, Theodore Lessing said that self-hate is an experience of the human race. That was no different today as it was then. And we have to open our eyes and address how it impacts us specifically. We're not going to do it with shame. We're not going to do it with anger. We're going to understand why this happened, and we're going to guard ourselves against it.
Excellent. For those in our audience, we are taking questions. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We've got time here in just a moment. Now, Ben, at the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, we believe in identifying problems and solving for them. For us to speak about all these various terminologies and concepts without providing opportunities for the general public to take action kind of be meaningless, I'd say. So bold. So how can Jews and non-Jews alike take collective action to harness the power of Jewish pride, as well as to fight Jewish hatred? And let me rephrase that. How can people harness the power of Jewish pride to fight Jew hatred?
Well, I'll start with Jewish people. Jewish pride teaches Jews that we deserve better, that what is done to us is wrong, what is said about us is wrong. We've done nothing wrong, though, and we deserve better. And that's when we know to raise our voice up, saying, actually, guys, this isn't okay. You can't say that about us. That's unfair. We deserve better. And it really is as simple as that. It gives us a sense of pride, gives us a sense of self-respect, self-confidence. We're not going to just accept it. We're not going to keep our heads down. We're going to raise our voices up. We're going to defend ourselves with pride. Now, for non-Jewish people, I think that it's about understanding the role that they play. And non-Jewish people, we want to empower and embrace our non-Jewish allies, and we want them to first and foremost just listen to us. Jews need to have the confidence to talk about our experiences, but non-Jews need to know to listen. When we talk about our experiences, please just listen. It's okay that people might not understand it. Why would they? There's many experiences that aren't mine that I don't understand. So it's about coming to the conversation with humility, with openness, and understanding that this is a different experience because the Jewish people are a distinct, separate people. So, excuse me, non-Jewish people should listen. And then once they've listened, once they've continued to do the work and to grow as allies, and by the way, this is work that we all have to do, right? When we're discussing whichever type of ally or whoever we want to be an ally to, then they have to go into the world and they need to raise their voices about Kanye. They need to say, Kanye, you can't say this about the Jewish people. The Jewish people do not deserve this. This is unfair. This is racism. So Jewish pride instills confidence. It empowers people. It educates people, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. I mean, I've had, wonderful people in my life, non-Jewish, who said to me that Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, my first book, helped them think about their identities. One of my former students said it helped her think about her Chinese pride. That's wonderful. So non-Jewish people can read my books and they can also learn about themselves. But of course, I want them to learn about the Jewish experience. What does it mean to be a Jew? Give space to their Jewish friends to talk about. Seek out Jewish voices to understand the Jewish experience and how Jews experience the world. But for Jews, it tells us we deserve better, that we've done nothing wrong, and that we should raise our voices. And because I really fundamentally believe that Jewishness does not belong to you, Nelson, or me, or anyone in this call. It belongs to the Jewish people as a collective. And it's our job on earth right now to take care of it, to mend it, to repair it before we pass it on to the next generations. We can only pass on something whole and healthy if we do the work in our lifetime. If we raise children knowing that despite what the non-Jewish world may say, we love our Jewishness. We're not going to allow them to make us feel shame. We're not going to allow them to diminish our rituals, to diminish our civilization. It is unique and it is beautiful. And every Jew needs to understand that. And you can understand that while being an American, being a Brit, or of course, being in Israel. But we're not going to look to the non-Jewish world for a definition. We're going to find ourselves and we're going to reclaim our story. It's our story to tell.
Thank you. So we have a few questions from the audience. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is do them kind of in a rapid fire.
Okay.
Just maybe we can get through all of them. First of all, how do you feel about anti-Israel bias and the apartheid claim against, or I shouldn't say against, but which is used amongst progressives?
Yeah. So the idea that Israel's an apartheid state is a lie. And what people need to understand is these are not organic lies. This didn't just pop up from the world. This was a lie that was created and was spread during the Cold War by the Arab states and the Soviet Union. And in the 1960s, they said that Africa's in a white stranglehold between Southern Africa and Israel. So these ideas have been circulating for a good while. It's not true. Israel's not an apartheid state. And that's not to say we can't criticize Israeli policy. That's not the same as this, but we're not going to tell outright lies. And we also have to understand why apartheid. It's just the same reason as saying the Israelis are the new Nazis. It wounds us and it creates us as a specific evil. Nazism, apartheid are understood to be specific evils in the world. And therefore, when we accuse Israel or Jews of that behavior, it justifies everything that's done and said against us, because look how evil we are.
Right. And Ben, sorry to interject, but many of those examples that you just named, those are examples under the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. Absolutely. Right? Referring to Israeli policy as being a Nazi, holding Israel to a double standard, holding Jews, wherever you live in the world, accountable for the actions of the state of Israel. These are all classic examples of contemporary and age-old anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely right, Nelson. And with regards to anti-Israel bias exists because of Jew hate. And again, people can strongly critique the Israeli government policy. They can even do it in a way that I wouldn't feel comfortable with. They can do it in a way that I don't agree with. But you can critique Israeli government policy in the way you would any other policy, any other government's policy. But this inherent anti-Israel bias that this person referenced is rooted in Jew hate. Israel is the collective Jew. So everything that's said about us as a people is now said about Israel. Blood libel, racial libel, economic libel, conspiracy fancy, it's all Israel. So we have to reject it and we have to teach our children. We have to have nuanced conversations about Israel. I think that was part of our failing, in that we didn't have nuanced conversations about Israel. We have nuanced conversations about Israel, but we reject these lies and we call them for what they are. We draw boundaries and say, no, this is a lie. Israel is not an apartheid state. You cannot have people from minority groups in parliament speaking in their native languages and for it to be an apartheid state. That doesn't make any sense. And we also have to understand the kind of inherently, no, I take that back, not inherent, but the anti-Jewish culture that exists in many of these social justice organizations, like Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty International.
Right. It seems every day Amnesty International is finding new ways to take shots at the one Jewish state. I think it was just last week they were reviving the apartheid claim.
Yeah, they love it.
And this is to their global audience of individuals who are social justice warriors. Do you ever think about moving to Israel due to anti-Semitism? How do you feel about making Aliyah as a collective response to anti-Semitism? Not trying to encourage you one way or another to move from where you're from and go to Israel, but rather just the concept of Aliyah and those around the world who use it as a vehicle to escape the Jew hatred that they face.
Well, to reference something that you said at the beginning, Nelson, what a wonderful thing. How incredible that we have somewhere to go, not just somewhere, that we have our home to go to. I love the idea of Aliyah. My brother made Aliyah 20 years ago. My sister made Aliyah probably about 15 years ago. My mother is making Aliyah. My father sadly passed away before he was able to make Aliyah. So yes, I love Israel. When I talk about Israel, and that's not love blind to its faults. Sometimes love you've got to criticize strongly, but I love Israel very deeply. When I talk about Israel, I say we, and I've always said that. So
clearly your family is there. So yes. When you think of Israel, you're not just thinking of a country or a nation or the Jewish state, you're thinking of your literal family.
Yeah. And it's my home. I really feel that way. You know, I love Scotland and I'm living in London right now and I love it and it's great. And I love going to theatre and doing cool things. But yeah, Israel is my home. I think if Jews want to make Aliyah, then we should encourage them and we should help them, but we shouldn't force people. You know, I think that people get to choose, and it's also okay that a Jewish person wants to live in America or Britain or France or wherever. That's fine, you know, but the fact that there is somewhere that our home, we have it, it's reestablished. I said this on Twitter yesterday, Zionism is the greatest decolonization movement in the history of the world. No community in the history of mankind has been expelled from its homeland for 2,000 years and then reclaimed it later. That is just, it's magnificent. I mean, it's the greatest story
ever.
Like
reclaiming Hebrew. It's like reclaiming the language of Hebrew, right? Literally brought back
Amazing.
the language that hadn't been used.
Yes.
Right.
It's literally, I told
One
them
of
when
a kind.
I taught a class last year called The Story of the Jews. And I said to my students, I was like, I'm biased, but this is the greatest story you will ever hear. And then at the end of the class, I was like, so? And they were like, yeah, it's an epic.
We've got time for just one last question here. What is one piece of advice that you would give to young Jews experiencing anti-Semitism today?
Wow. One piece of advice is to find pride in their Jewishness. And I don't say that flippantly. I don't say that as like a wide answer. That was me paintbrushing, by the way. I say that because I think it's the most important thing to do. Root themselves in their Jewishness. In this new book, I talk about a Jewish anchor. I say each of us need to be anchored into our Jewishness because the world around us is constantly swirling and it's almost a hurricane of hate all the time. But we need to be anchored deep into our Jewishness. So I would say to someone, find something once a day that you can do that anchors you into your Jewishness. Now, I'm not here to tell you how to do that. I believe that Jewishness is a big buffet table. And each of us gets to come up and choose from this table. Nelson, you may love shakshuka. I might love chopped liver and chicken soup. And each of us will get up off our seats at this huge simcha and we'll go and get something to eat. And we'll all choose different things. That is what it means to be a Jew. You have to go to the table, though. We can't be down the road at a different cafe saying, oh, this is what Jewishness is. No, we have to choose from our own table because we are a rule-driven civilization. But there is great diversity and great freedom. So every day, for example, I put on a kippah. I do my hair, I get dressed, and before I leave the house, I clip in my kippah. So that's something that I do that roots me into my Jewishness. I've also just started experimenting with keeping kosher. I was raised kosher until I was about 25. And then from 25 to, literally 2 weeks ago, I did not keep kosher. And now I want to, I've spoken to my partner a lot about it. I said I want to keep kosher again, or at least try to keep kosher, because it reminds me when I'm going out for dinner, oh, I can't eat that. And it's not, oh no, I can't eat that, I'm so sad. It's because I'm choosing not to eat that because I'm rooting myself in my Jewishness. That at this moment, at this dinner table, at this party, I'm reminding myself that I'm a Jew, and that's what it means to be a Jew. Now, not everyone else has to do that. So whether it's kippah, whether it's prayers, whether it's lighting the Shabbat candles, whether it's listening to music, whether it's eating Jewish food, that's always a good one. Who doesn't love Jewish food? We have to do something. To be Jewish is not just an idea, it's active. So find something that gives you joy, that brings you joy, and do it, because that anchors us into our Jewishness and helps stabilize us when we are bombarded with hate. It feels like we're being bombarded. And I think that, you asked for one thing, but I'm going to give you a second little answer is learn. What does it mean to be a Jew? Where are we from? What is our experience? Because to me, the fact that, I don't know how many of us are in this call actually, but the fact that there's us in this call in 2022 still talking about Jewish identity, 2,000 years after we were expelled from our indigenous land, that's a miracle. But we have to know our history. And listen, not everyone needs to be a history scholar like me, but you have to basically know your history. We came from this land, we emerged in this time. Did we know that the first mention of the word Israel was on the Merneptah stele, an Egyptian engraving from 3,300 years ago? And here we are, 2022, still talking about it? It's a miracle. So education and action. I believe that is how we withstand the hurricane that swirls around us.
Thank you so much for your time today, Ben M. Freeman. Again, Reclaiming Our Story, The Pursuit of Jewish Pride is available Monday. You can pre-order that along with Ben's first book, both online as well as where all good books are sold. Thank you to our esteemed author. We wish you much success with the launch of your book. We know you'll be traveling throughout North America, and if you're interested in having Ben come to your local community, or if you want to learn more, please do connect with him. He's very active on social media, specifically on Twitter, but also go out and buy his book and support Jewish Pride. So Ben, thank you for being with us and good luck with your tour.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nelson.